Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. This is a sort of follow-on from the Sunday morning chat. Sorry, Sunday morning and afternoon chats. I must learn not to waffle on so long. Although many people seem to appreciate the long ones and some don't. I can't please all the people all the time. But this chat is about the potential of an individual orchid. Yeah, be it a hybrid or a species. Yeah, it doesn't matter. The potential. Right, now let's go to the wild. You hear me talking about plants growing in the wild. Well, first of all, I'll say that I have some friends that have been there, seen it and done it, and taken photos and slides of which I've studied and looked at. Trips to Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, the lower slopes of the Himalayas, northern India, Ecuador, Brazil, Mexico, many places. I don't know anyone who's visited Australia, but I do know some people who live there and grow orchids. So let's talk about plants in the wild. The orchid mentality is I will produce as many seeds as I possibly can. They'll look like dust and the wind will blow them away, and I'll hope that some of them may grow. And some of them will, but not many. Yeah? So let's go from the point that an orchid seed manages to find a place, manages to germinate, and starts to grow. Is it always going to be in the best place? No. It could be lucky, and it might not be. So let's take an example of a highlight requirement dendrobium, for instance. Now, I've seen pictures of some of these sat on the tops of branches with no leaf cover. Yeah, it's just a branch that hangs out on a slope so it gets full sun and everything, and that's what that plant seems to like. But have a look at the plant. It's appalling. It's tatty, it's shriveled, and yet it's still in bloom. But has it reached its potential? The answer is no. How much feed do you think that orchid's getting on a branch with nothing above it but sky? What does it get? It gets rain. And it might even absorb some of the dead matter that falls off itself. The odd leaf that falls off and gets trapped and finally decays and gives it a bit of food. That's like getting your own back. So you see what I mean? Now, orchids in the wild will move if they have an opportunity. Let's take that dendrobium. If that managed to get a hold on the north side of a branch and it needs high light, it's not going to get it. So it's going to push up some new growths, perhaps around the plant. Which are the growths that it's going to put its effort into growing? It's not the ones heading away from the light, is it? It's the ones that are in better light. They'll get the strength and the energy. And then when they produce new growths, they're pushing the plant towards a better place. They move. Yeah? Now let's take an opposite. Let's say a coelogeny that likes some shade, yeah? Manages to get a hold, sat right on the top of a flat branch. Yeah? The light's too high. So when it pushes out its new growths, the ones that are going to do best and get pushed and produce more stronger new growths are the ones heading towards the shade, the ones heading down the side of the branch that doesn't get the strongest light. They move. As I say, you find a plant that needs a more shady position that's managed to get a hold on top of a branch and go back in 10 years' time, it won't be there anymore. It'll be down the side or underneath, whereas where it gets some less light, it'll move. And the older parts of the plant will just get discarded. They won't get any energy put into them. They'll dump their leaves and they'll shrivel. And that's the old part of the plant. Now that's in the wild, where, quite honestly, most orchids are on rations. They do the best they can with what they're given, and sometimes what they're given is nowhere near enough. So they hang on. They just about hang on. And I've seen lots of pictures of orchids in the wild, and those plants really are not up to much as a plant. If you were allowed and you could, and you took one of those plants off its branch and detached it and took it to a show the next day, it would fail miserably. They do not look that good. They can be quite tatty. They haven't got antelopes walking past, in our growing environments. They haven't got animals walking past taking a bite out of them and all that sort of stuff. So now let's pull back and think about our own growing environments, whether it be a windowsill, a shelf in a house with some artificial lights, a grow room like mine, a standalone greenhouse, all these growing outside. Oh, I saw some smashing pictures of people's orchids getting absolutely drowned in the rain. Lucky tykes. But there comes a downside. As I said, some people in Australia lost orchids because they grow outside, didn't have the ability to take them indoors, and they had so much torrential rain, the rot set in. Yeah? The rain cooled everything down, everything remained soaking wet day on, day on, day on. And they got rot set in. They lost some plants. Yeah? Well, what would happen to plants in the wild if something like that happened then? They'd die. They wouldn't make it. So there are harsh conditions out there in the wild. In our growing environments, if there's any harsh conditions, we've created them. Or not avoided them. Let's put it a bit more politely. Anyway, following on from anticipating what orchids ought to be doing, there is a limit where a plant reaches its potential. It's doing the best it can in the environment you've got. So there comes a point where progress stops. Is that a worry? Well, it could be, unless you understand that. And that's what I'm getting at in this chat, because that's all it is, a chat. Let's point at something attractive while I'm chatting, rather than vacant space. So, reaching a plant's potential. Let's take an Oncidium type. There's a huge big bushy one like this. Well, I haven't had this long, and the new growths have pushed on nicely, and there is a number of them. Now, in my mindset, I will think that all of those new growths are going to bloom. They may have one, they may have 2 spikes per bulb, but I haven't had the plant long enough to work that out yet, whether that's normal or not for this plant. But don't forget, there has to be a qualification there. Is it normal for this plant in my environment? Yeah? In somebody else's environment, it might do something different. But anyway, the progress on this plant would be measured by next year it at least does the same thing or more. But what about, given the size of this plant, it's got its old part of the plant. I don't think there's a leafless bulb. Yeah, there's a couple of leafless bulbs on it. That's natural for Oncidium types. Yeah, and this is a species, so more natural perhaps than some of the hybrids. So older leaves I'd expect to drop, but not at a rate of knots. I'd only expect leaves to drop a year at a time. And because I haven't had the plant long enough, I don't know which bulbs go with which year's growth. You see what I mean? So difficult to tell on this one. But I've got a number of new growths, all of which I expect to bloom. Goes back to the anticipation of the Sunday chat. But what about if next year it only puts up the same number of growths? Is that a problem? Probably not in this case, because this plant's doing well. So if I get the same amount next year, I'll be happy. If I get less, I'll give it some thought. You see what I mean? Yeah? So you can expect progress, but there becomes a limit. In your growing environment, the plant has reached its full potential. That's as good as it can be for you. Knowing when that happens is not easy. Oh, here's a classic little one. This is Arengus fastuosa. I've had this years. I don't even remember how long I've had this one. Its progress is based on the fact that it does exactly the same as it did the year before. I don't expect any more from this. First time it ever bloomed, it had a spike and a couple of blooms. The next time, it had 2 spikes and a couple of blooms. Last time, it had 2 spikes and more blooms. What's it going to do next time? I don't expect it to get any better. You don't see this plant any bigger than this. And I don't even remember this plant dropping an old leaf, but it looks like that one at the bottom might go. But it's grown a new little plantlet out the side. So that one's going to push on now. That produced a very weak, feeble spike, but it's a new part to the plant. Yeah. So progress on that has now slowed to a minimum. I'd expect to see at least a pair of new leaves per year, and I'd expect it to at least produce those 2 spikes again. Now if next year that mother plant only produces 1 spike, it's going backwards. Then I'll have to stop and think. And I won't stop and think, what am I doing wrong, because this plant's got a history where it's progressed and done well. So it won't necessarily be me. But what it could be is it could do with some more root space. I've now got quite a few aerial roots on this, which always become more difficult to hydrate, but it is producing some new ones. Yeah. So it might need a bigger mount to accommodate a better root system. But I'll worry about that as and when it happens. It's not a problem yet, but might be. Right, I'll give you a classic example which from this point forward is going to get followed up, because it is a plant that I've had a while and I'm worried about it. I'll just quickly diverse. This bulbophyllum would not bloom despite being a mature plant. Well, like I've said, and I think I said it on Sunday, I'll say it again. If you've got a plant in a certain place and it won't bloom, and you carry on doing the same thing over and over again, why would you expect the result to change? If you do the same thing over and over again, you will get the same results. Well, this one wouldn't bloom, so I thought, right, you're going to get more light, and in doing so, because I changed its position, it also got more heat. My big circulating fans have quite a dramatic cooling effect, and this was quite close to them. Well, now it's not. Now it's got buffers of other plants that stop those circulating fans having such a dramatic effect, so it's warmer. Yeah? And it's also brighter. And we now have 1, 2, 3, 4 spikes. 5 spikes. There's another one down the bottom. Woo! So it's now blooming. So the change did some good. But it's also probably condemned itself. Because if you look at the spike that's the most developed, I can't see that blooms, whatever you want to call it, on the end of that spike getting much bigger than that. And if that's it, then I don't want it anymore, because it doesn't do anything for me. It flipping grows like a weed. But if that's the state of its blooming, it's not going to be for me. But I changed something and it worked. Yeah, so that's now progress. I can't make it grow any better. It's growing as well as it can. And I don't think that's ever dropped a leaf. It's getting bigger all the time. But there'll come a point where it will. And if it starts dropping a lot of leaves all at once, I'll worry about it. But the chances are it's going to be somebody else's problem, because I'm not too happy with that bloom. I was expecting more than that. Right, my Dendrobium Nestor, I'm not going to get it down, now becomes something to monitor. History of this plant: I bought it in bloom with a single cane in bloom. The following year I was over the moon because it produced 3 new growths. But they were weak, they were not strong, they did not reach their full size by any means, but they bloomed reasonably well. So I was happy at that point. The following year it only produced 2 new growths, and I thought, what's going wrong? But those 2 new growths stonked ahead, grew bigger than the canes that were on the plant, and bloomed the full length of the canes. Over the moon. What's it doing this year? It's only got 1 new growth. Now I'm worried. That's going backwards. Now it may be that that's going to be the best cane it's ever produced, but it's only 1 cane to bloom next spring. Now I was expecting at least 2 and hoped for 3. That's back to the anticipation again, and it hasn't done it. This plant's going backwards, and I need to find out why. My theory is that at the time it was pushing all those buds out, which, as I've always said, if you've got a winter rester, Once those buds start pushing away from the canes and start to expand, if you don't help, it will drain the resources in the plant to try and bloom. So your canes will shrivel. It'll take all its resources from the older canes until they're drained and there's not much left to manage to bloom. Maybe I started feeding this at too low a level or too late in the day for the amount of blooms it was producing. So it could be my fault, but that's going to be difficult to prove till next year, unfortunately. And that's only a theory. I can't prove that one way or the other. But we are going to keep our eye on Dendrobium nesta, because one cane is not good enough. Not on this plant. Yeah. Now the one next to it, my anosmum, that had loads of old canes when I got it and no roots. And it managed to push a new growth out and it managed to bloom. And last year it managed 2 new growths and they bloomed. Or did it, or was it only 1? Can't remember. But this year I've got 2 new growths. They've started late in the season. You know, the top one up there is only 2 inches long. The little one underneath it is about ½ an inch long. They've just started. But the way I'm going to water and feed that, it's going to have every opportunity to produce full-size canes. Yeah? My Nesta cane, I've got no problem with that reaching its full size. I know it will. Back to the anticipation. I know it will reach full size. But 1's no good to me. I was expecting 2 and hoping for 3. So next spring, I need to do something different. Like I say, you repeat the same thing over and over again, you'll get the same results. And I do not only want 1 cane a year on this plant. I want this plant to get bigger and better. There is a theory that the plant is trying to distribute all of its food and resources into all the canes it's got. So the more older canes you've got, the less there is for the new canes. Theory. Don't know. Yeah. I know somebody who had one of the best set of anosmums I've ever seen. That's John Benedict. And he made the mistake at the end of a season of cutting off old canes. And he didn't get his blooms. And when he inquired back to where those plants came from, to real good anosmum growers, they said, "Oh goodness me, you can't cut off too many old canes because that's where the energy comes from for the blooms. It's stored in the old canes through the winter, through the rest." So on that one, taking the older canes off gave it a miserable failure in the blooming front. So I got a decision to make, but we're going to keep our eye on Nesta. Now it may push out another new growth, might even push out more than 1, but I'll have trouble getting them to full size. But if I get some more growth on that, my worry will lessen dramatically on the grounds that even if they don't reach full size, I know, anticipation, I'll get them to bloom. But we'll work on that one. We'll keep our eye on it because it's not doing what it should do. Knowing what a plant should do is half the battle. And what it should do is what it did last time, or better. What it shouldn't do is what it did last time, worse. In other words, not as good as last time. But then we come back to the full potential of a plant. When a plant reaches that stage, yeah, it pushes up the number of growths it's capable of. It blooms as best it can in your environment. What can you expect the following year? The same. The progress stops, and that happens. A plant has reached its full potential, yeah, and that can happen. And at that point, when it only does the same as it's done over the last few years, instead of worrying about it, give yourself a pat on the back, because you've got a plant to its full potential in your growing environment. How can it get any better than that? That's not a problem. That's not a worry. That's as good as it gets for that plant for you. And that's where you get the pat on the back and take away the worries. What you don't want to see is plants going backwards. Yeah? Plants reaching a stage where they progress evenly Year on, year on, year on is good stuff. Yeah, that's as good as it's going to get. Now you could think, what about if I fed it some more? Well, there's a limit to how much a plant can take in. You know, it will use the food it's given up to the point where it can't use any more. And any more that it gets, it just won't use. Yeah? It's wasted. A lot of it will sit in a pot because it won't take it in the first place. It's already full. Yeah? That can happen. Yeah? And, you know, that's as good as it gets. I mean, your feed that you use, you could think, right, okay, I've got this plant and it hasn't been doing that well. I'll change something. I've just said something's not doing well, change something. So, I changed my fertiliser for all my orchids. That's going to be difficult to see the results immediately. It could take a long time. And then you have to stop and think, well, hang on, this plant seems to be doing better since I changed my fertiliser. Is it the fertiliser? Or is it just the plant is getting stronger? This year it pushed up a better root system. Is that the fertiliser, or is that the plant just doing what it's supposed to do? Yeah? Until it gets to its full potential. And that's the difficult bit. Has my plant got as good as it's ever going to get for me? And when it does, pat on the back. Stop the worrying. A plant that's progressing year on year will have its limits. It will get to the point where it can't do any better. Think about the logic. If an orchid, let's go back to in the wild again, was capable of getting better and better and better, how big would that dendrobium I mentioned sat on the end of that branch in the light? How big would it get? What would happen to the branch it sat on? The plant could get so big and heavy it would break the branch it's on. There's a limit. It's often limited in the wild by its rations. But you see what I mean? If orchids were potentially capable of just getting bigger and bigger and larger and stronger and everything like that, they'd take over the world. As would all the other plants on the planet. There is a limit to each plant's potential. And with orchids, it's often difficult to work out. But progress is quite easy to monitor. Maximum potential is not, because it could seem to you like things are not going right. You know, I've had 2 growths on this every year so far. I was expecting 3 this year. Well, it might only ever produce 2, that plant in your environment. So step back sometimes and just analyse. If it's a new plant, you've got no history, you don't know. And you'll gain that as you keep your plant alive year on, year on. It'll just happen over time. If you're new to orchids, you haven't had that time yet. And if I remember my early days, everything's a worry in those days. You get over it, trust me. It gets better. It's not always a worry. If it's always a worry, well, perhaps you ought to try growing something else. I'm kidding, but you know what I mean. Some people take to orchids and some people struggle. Well, why have a hobby that you struggle with permanently? It should always get better until it gets to the point where you have reached your potential. And for you, in your growing environment, with the plants you've got, you've reached as good as it gets. And when you reach that stage, the chances are your plants will too. And lifestyle kicks in there, because that can get in the way, especially if you're still a working person. But you see what I mean. There is a limit to how much you can push your plants. I mean, take for a classic example, a Tolumnia. These grow on little tiny twigs. Yeah? How do they maintain themselves? By getting bigger and bigger and bigger? They can't, can they? They're on twigs. Every time it produces a new fan, the weight of the plant gets more. Well, there would come a time when it couldn't support itself. It would snap the twigs it's on. It would fall off, and then it's probably going to die. So it compensates by retracting older parts of the plant. It has a natural way of eventually dropping its older fans, replaced by the new ones which will bloom. Now, that's how it maintains itself. And it keeps itself to its maximum potential in the environments it's in. Because if it doubled in size, it would fall out. It would break its support. It would drop, and then it's going to die probably. Yeah? So, as I say, plants have a maximum potential. A lot of it's based on where they manage to get a hold in the first place and start to grow. Yeah? A plant that's going to grow really big and heavy, that manages to take root on a tiny little branch, might not be going to make it in the long term. So you see what I mean? You know, that in the wild, things don't go to plan. When they do, you'll get a good plant, and it doesn't happen often. The plants in the wild are often really scruffy, tatty, and they just about hang on. That's not what should be happening for us, because we've got control. We haven't got antelopes walking past taking chunks out of our plants. I know somebody who gets squirrels, but you see what I mean. Yeah, we've got control. We know how much feed we're going to give our plants. We know how often. We know whether they're wet. We know whether they're dry. And we deal with it accordingly. That's important. In the wild, they get the rain when it happens. They don't get to choose. And if they get a drought and they don't get enough, they might not make it. They might just about hang on and abort their new growths because they're too dry. Then they'll have to start again. That's the wild. Our environments are not the wild. It's controlled. We have that control. It's up to us to maximise it to the best of our ability, the best of our knowledge, and the best that our environments will allow. Because they're not perfect. They're not perfect. So understand that a plant can reach its maximum potential in your care, and that's as good as it's going to get. And instead of worrying that it's not progressing anymore when it used to, just appreciate the fact that it may be now doing the best it possibly can. And that's good. That's not a bad thing at all. That's good. So anyway, enjoy your orchids. That was sparked off by a conversation with another YouTuber. Sparked off, not in detail, but yeah. So yeah, we do what we can. Bottom line, always. Yeah. And I always finish with something like along the lines: ask yourself, are my orchids doing okay? And if the answer is yes, great. But you always ask yourself, could they be doing better? The ultimate goal is when the answer to that is no. Think it through. See you next time. Bye for now.